Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to finish up bag A on the Tamiya wrecker. We're going to be attaching the servos and the steering bell cranks and checking that it all works. Here we go then, step 7, the shift servo. We'll need the shift servo on its mount from step 2, the front crossmember C2 and 7 3x8 self-tappers. At the end of the last video, we left the chassis with most of the cross members fitted, but with all the screws left loose. That'll make it easy to slide in the shift servo on its mount and install the 3 screws from the top. Again, we're not going to do them up all the way. The last cross member goes right in at the front of the chassis. It has a right way up, so check the diagram carefully before fitting the screws. And again, we're not going to quite do them up all the way. Right. Now we have all the bits in the chassis together, we can start tightening up all the screws. We want to start in one corner, taking up the slack, moving to the opposite corner and going end to end, working through all the screws. Then once there's no slack, we'll go around again and nip them up following the same routine. For more info, look up using your favourite search engine, Talking Down an Engine Head. It's exactly the same principle and very useful to learn. It's all about avoiding stresses in the build. In our case, we should end up with a nice straight chassis. Step 8, the steering bell cranks. For screws and bits, we have 4 M2x5s, 4 M3 plain nuts, 2 1150 bearings to replace the bushings, 2 850 bearings, again to replace the bushings, 4 5mm ball ends, and the 2 steering shafts with the splined ends. For plastic, we have 2 similar assemblies. The arm lengths are slightly different though, so keep an eye out. The top set is a C7, C14, C16 and a C6. This is your typical setup used in the single steer trucks. The bottom set has a D7, E5, D4 and D6. These should give you slightly less steering for the inner axle. Something else to think about, it's not a bad idea to have a set of shims handy too. There's a fair amount of float in these shafts once they're assembled, which can manifest itself as steering slop. With a couple of suitable shims, you can just about make these run perfectly. We'll look at this in more detail when we start doing some upgrades. First, we'll fit the ball ends into the top assembly. For C7 we only have a single hole, so it's just a case of using a ball end and one of the plain nuts. We'll also use some thread lock to make sure it's not going to come apart. We'll use the thread lock on the end of the thread and wind the screw in and out technique so we don't get any on the plastic. On the other arm, C6, we have a choice of 2 holes. Usually a difficult decision, but with this though, we need to use the right hole so the relative motion of the 2 bell cranks is correct. In this assembly, we need to use the inner hole. Again, we will use some thread lock to make sure it doesn't fall out. In the bottom assembly, the ball ends go in the same way, except we want to use the outer hole in the arm with 2 holes. Before we start putting the shafts together, we'll apply some thread lock in the end holes. We need to pop a spot of thread lock over the hole, then use a cocktail stick to stir it around. This will avoid getting anywhere we don't want it and keep it all looking nice and clean. Next we can pop the single hole arm on one end and screw in one of the M2 screws. Now I found that the micro driver for the tiny bodywork screws does the trick with these M2 screws too. They don't need to be crazy tight, just nicely nipped up. And besides, I've got a nice micro screwdriver set at the ready for when we really need the precision. Next we slide one of the small bearings over the shaft, followed by the C16 spacer. Insert into the carrier, C14, then pop in one of the big bearings, making sure it's fully seated. Install the double hole arm as shown in the diagram. It's critical that it's at the right angle. Then screw in another M2 screw. The lower assembly is largely the same, just with the different part numbers. Just make sure you get the angles of the arms right, and that's step 8. You should have the 2 bits ready to fit in a couple of steps, just keep track of which is which. Step 9, the rods. Always super exciting. We need 2 3x16 threaded shafts, a 3x32 rod and a 3x37.7 rod. the 205mm rods, and loads of rod ends. Ultimately, we're going to replace most of these as they're notoriously sloppy, but for now we'll follow the manual and use the Tamiya parts. They're all just a simple case of grabbing the rod and threading on the rod ends. The two short ones just have the rod ends butted up against each other. The longer ones though need to be built with a specific gap between them. You can hold them over the diagram, or if you have a vernier or even a ruler, you can measure accurately, and more often than not you won't need to adjust them later. It takes a while to do and it's really boring, but do spend the time to get them right. It'll make everything much simpler later in the build. Step 10. Fitting the steering servo. We'll need the 2 bell crank assemblies, the 2 middle-sized rods, 4 M3x6s, 6 M3x12s, the steering servo on its mount, and the chassis. The servo mounts to the side of the chassis just in front of the rear front leaf spring mount. There's 2 M3x6s that go up from the bottom and 2 that go in from the side. For now, do them up just far enough to take up the slack. Next the bell cranks go on, with the one using the standard parts towards the front, using 4 of the M3x12s. On the other side of the servo we use the other bell crank, the one with the odd part numbers, using 2 more of the M3x12s. Not sure why they don't use all 4, but I suppose 2 must be good enough. Again, just take up the slack in the screws. To make sure none of those bits fall off, we need to apply some thread lock to the exposed threads inside the chassis. Just a small blob applied to each one with a cocktail stick. Then we go around each screw and undo it a couple of turns, then tighten it properly so we get a bit of the thread lock in the threads. Once they're all nipped up, we can soak up any excess with a kitchen towel. The last bit is to clip on the rod ends, the shorter one at the front and the longer one at the rear. Now at some point we will eliminate the servo saver, so chances are we're also going to rework the steering linkages a bit. Looking ahead in the manual, it's not impossible that we might set up the steering using 2 steering servos, with a programmed differential to get the steering ratio between the axles. That might be a bit overkill though, but maybe that's the point. If we connect up a servo tester, we can see we get far more steering throw at the front with the stock setup. Any mods would need to have the same effect to get good smooth steering. Anyway, that's bag A complete. In bag B, we will be building up and installing the front axles, so we'll aim to do all of those steps in one go rather than keep on breaking things up. So until then, as always, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!